Hello and welcome to A Critical Dragon, where I talk about narrative in film, television, and in books. And today I want to talk about approaches to reviewing. And I know I did a video on this in the past, but a little bird told me that a certain nemesis of mine, Dr. Philip Chase, was going to be doing a video about how he reviews. So I don't know if this is going to come out before his, but I thought I would talk a bit about this because a few months ago, I did a video basically asking people how they reviewed. And one of the really surprising things is everyone has their own idea of what a review is, what a review should do, and how they want to go about it. And to be perfectly honest, if you think about it, it shouldn't really be that surprising. We all have our unique approaches to thinking and talking about books. But one of the strange things that comes up is if I say, I'm going to talk about reviewing a book, and I'm saying book review, your concept in your head of what a book review is, does not necessarily match what my concept of a book review is. And there's this weird disconnect. We're using the same term, we're technically referring to what we think is the same thing, but because we all have a different approach to it, because we all think about what a book review does in different ways, there can be not a meeting of minds, that there's miscommunication. We're talking past each other rather than talking about the same thing. So I wanted to raise a couple of very, very basic points and then talk about some of the questions and some of the points that when I used to review a lot of books, that I tried to bring in, and it was very, very dependent on what the book was that I was reviewing or what the narrative was that I was reviewing. But I had a whole sort of set of questions and queries that I usually cycled through to see whether or not they were relevant to the thing that I was actually engaged in reviewing. So the first thing I want to talk about is, I always say that subjectivity, objectivity is the wrong debate about reviewing, because there are always going to be elements of subjectivity, always, because it involves the understanding, expertise, experience, training, and education of the reviewer when they're reviewing something. And that's going to be unique to them, and it's going to filter their perceptions. So there's always going to be that taken into account. But there is a distinction, and I think it's an important one and a useful one, between whether or not a review or a response to a text is about your own personal reading experience, your own personal response, or whether or not you're trying to evaluate the text, or whether or not you're trying to step between those 2 points, or if you're trying to place the text in context. And what I mean by this is, I'll see if I can find my amazing graphic of a triangle. But when we think the author information about when the text was written and when this author wrote it and where the author was living and all that sort of stuff, that remains fixed in time. That can't change. Nothing about that changes. The text was written by that person at that time when they were living somewhere, blah, 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 blah. The text itself always remains fixed. Unless, of course, there's like a 10th anniversary edition or a 100th or a centenary edition, or here's the director's deleted scenes that we've added in. But for the most part, the text remains fixed. The words on the page don't change. And then the last point of this triangle is us, the reader, who we are. And why this is important is the reader is the only thing that is entirely flexible. And the reader is the only point in which opinions and everything actually changes. Because if you think, when you read a book when you are 15 years old and you go, oh my God, this is the world's greatest book ever, and then you reread it 20 years later, your opinion of that book might have changed. And it might have changed because your knowledge of the genre has improved. You've read a greater variety of books and understand different techniques. You've seen other things and experience other forms of narrative. So when you look back on that book that you read when you were 15, even though the text hasn't changed, the author and publication information hasn't changed, you will have an entirely different reading experience. Even though you are technically, like the same legal entity, So when we talk about our personal reading experiences, those things are always transitory. They change over time, even when referring to the same books. But if you're focused on talking about the text and the text in context of when and where it was written and who wrote it and the different things going on in the world or the culture at the time, those things remain relatively constant. Like they don't change. So if your review is focused very much on how you felt when you read the book, when you read it, that review is not going to be applicable even to you in 10 years' time, because you'll be a different person. Now, there might be some aspects of it you absolutely go, yeah, I still feel exactly the same way. I've just reread the book and I felt exactly the same way about this, this, and this. But it is also entirely possible that you will feel completely different about the book. So you could film another reader response and it would be different. Even though it's about the same book, you're technically the same person. But if you had filmed a review that was focused primarily on what the text is doing and what we find in the text and different elements that describe aspects of the text and perhaps relating it to its position within the field at the time, then that review actually can remain fairly constant. Someone can read that review in 10 years' time, 50 years' time, 100 years' time, and that review will still contain a lot of information that is absolutely applicable. So there's a longevity to that because it is not an ephemeral approach. So that was the first thing I wanted to discuss. Now, the second thing is, one of the things that we do is we tend to design rubrics. And I'll use this as an analogy to the stuff that we do at university. You design a grid and you have your key categories, and then you evaluate something based on that. And that way you design a system that is actually, fairly robust. And because you apply it to every single text and you grade every single text according to the same criteria and using the same rubric, it removes part of your personal reading experience from that. And it is less subjective. Not that it is fully objective. I'm not suggesting it is fully objective, but it is less subjective. But the issue is why we can never describe it as fully objective is because we chose the criteria. We actually picked the different topics and weighted them and put in the descriptors about how we're going to grade things on this. We designed all that, and that's going to be based on the things that we personally value or that we think society values. So it's an interpretation, and that is going to have a level of subjectivity to it. So even though you come up with an objective standard, it's always going to have a subjective foundation to a greater or lesser extent. So to give you an example of this obviously isn't about books. This is about cars. And if you think, if I had a supercar and a family sedan and a smart car, a little eco car, and I chose, I'm going to put option A. These are the criteria I'm going to apply to evaluate which is the best car. And clearly, looking at option A, the acceleration, the top speed, the size of the engine, the supercar is going to win hands down. But if I look at option B, and you might quibble and go, but those aren't the criteria I would choose. You go, yes, this is exactly the point. Reviewers, readers, when we choose criteria, we choose the things that we think are important. And someone might, when they're evaluating what is the best car to buy, might have a big family, and therefore how many passengers the car can hold will be a really important consideration, far more important than, say, how quickly it accelerates. They're not going racing in the car. They want to be able to drive their family around. And again, storage space. If you have a big family, you might need to be driving around with a lot of, when you do the weekly shop or even the daily shop, depending on how large your family is, but you might need a whole load of space in the back of the car in order to carry all of your shopping. And let's face it, supercars aren't really known for their boot or trunk space. And that could be a really important consideration when you're buying a family car. Number of cup holders. Okay, that seems slightly idiosyncratic, but that can be the kind of quirky thing that someone finds is very, very important. And so, to go back to books just for a second, they might have something about something specific to them that you go, I never would have considered that. That's such a niche thing to be thinking about. But for that person, that aspect is very, very important. And in this case, it's the driver always wants to have a hot drink and a cold drink when they are driving, and their passenger, their partner who's always with them, also wants that. So they need 4 cup holders in the front, and then there's a couple of kids in the back that they need cup holders as well. So the number of cup holders in the car could be a bizarrely important consideration when they're buying the car. And then when we think of this third option, you go miles per gallon, because fuel economy, cost of petrol and diesel is going up. I want to keep an eye on that. And that could be a major consideration. The cost of insurance, because it's not just about buying a car, it's about you have to insure the car afterwards. And let's face it, a supercar is not going to get very many miles to the gallon, and it's going to be very expensive to insure. And then average cost of tires. Why put that in? Because cars break down, car parts need to be replaced. And one of the things that needs to be replaced most often are the tires. We are constantly replacing and sorting out tires. So that is actually a good indicator if you're going to have the car for a long time, your average cost of repair. So you look at the cost of tires, because that gives you an idea of how much you're going to be spending per year on this car, in addition to all of the other running costs. So that could be a consideration you put in, because it gives people an idea of, how much repairs and parts are going to be. Because if they think a tire is going to cost $100 and the tires for your supercar are $5,000 because you have to get super special tires for it, that gives you an idea. And therefore, the average cost, if you want it to be low, again, the supercar is going to fail. So even on these 3, and I admit, slightly idiosyncratic, objective criteria that are being applied without my own personal preferences coming in, you can see that if we had picked option A, the supercar wins hands down. But if we pick option B, it's likely to be the family sedan. And if we pick option C, it's likely to be the smart car. So in each case, depending on the criteria we pick, we've completely skewed the results as to what the best car is. And this is the problem about using terms like the best book, or it is good. Terms like good and best and all these sorts of ways of describing texts are so nebulous and personal unless you define your terminology, unless you outline the criteria. And this is why academics always spend so much time arguing over what others consider the semantic details about the specific definitions of things. Because until you define your terms, you can end up with situations like this. The best car is the smart car. So if I said, and if I'd started this whole conversation by saying, right, I'm looking at a supercar, a family sedan, and a smart car, a little tiny car, to see which is the best car, and I went, and clearly the results are in, and it's the smart car, you would all probably go, how did you get to that conclusion? And yet, when you see my criteria, when you see how I evaluated it, you go, I can see how AP did that, but that's not how I do it. And this reveals that we have, when we're evaluating things, we have set criteria in our head. We have a weight that we attach to certain aspects. And quite often, when it comes to narrative, which is a lot more complex, there are things about narrative that we personally value. So we rate them higher, we rate them as more important. And unless we write it down, unless we have a really good understanding of how we approach things, what our bias and preference and choices are, then that can be quite muddied. And so when we are talking to other people and we go, I don't understand why you can't see how good this book is, it's because they don't know what your set of criteria are, and you don't know what their set of criteria are, because they could be looking at it in terms of option A and going, how can you say a smart car is better than a supercar? And you're looking at option C going, how can you say that a supercar is better than a smart car? You're looking at very practical, pragmatic terms, taking into account your current financial situation, and they're looking at it as, oh, the epitome of vehicular engineering, about a car that doesn't so much drive too quickly as fly too low. So what does this mean then for when we talk about books? Ta-da! Another set of options. And what you can see here is I've plugged in the first two columns, two different ways that are very, very common to approach aspects of talking about narrative. I've put in the categorizations, but what I haven't written in is how the things are being evaluated. So prose, world building, plot, characters, themes, setting, these are all standard aspects, categories, elements of narrative that we frequently discuss. But I haven't put in how the prose is being evaluated. What is it about the prose that is being discussed? I haven't put in evaluative criteria. I haven't said what is good prose, what is bad prose. None of that is in. It's just a sequence of categories that I'm basically going to work through in my head as I am thinking about the narrative. Of course, option B is the core-pile approach. And again, you can see it's very much linked to that breaking into narrative elements. So characters, atmosphere, writing style, plot, intrigue, logic and relationships, and enjoyment. And you can see one of the big differences between those two sets is that enjoyment is added in, and that's your personal reading experience. And if that is a separate category, what we take away from that is our discussion of characters, atmosphere, writing style, plot, intrigue, and the logical relationships. Those aspects are not about whether or not we like them. It's about discussing those elements. It's discussing what the book is doing with them, how the author employs them, the different styles and techniques and how things are realized. Enjoyment is then working in at the end personal reading experience as a separate element, but it is basically implying that all of the others should not be about how we enjoyed the characters. And then option C, I've just added in a couple of additional categories that actually might come in useful when thinking about narrative. So for instance, narrative perspective, what sort of narrator is it? What's when they have writing style, that could include narrative perspective, but you can talk about the style of narration. You can talk about whether or not it's focalized, whether or not it's omniscient. You can talk about whether the author is using character details on a character point of view to subtly change the actual style of narration. Little things like that. Genre. Why are genre and subgenre important, potentially important for a review? Well, if I'm talking about a new fantasy novel, I say this fantasy novel is really innovative. What I'm making a claim about is that it is doing something that hasn't happened in the genre before, in which case I'm making a claim about the rest of the genre, saying it never did this and now this book has, and this is a selling point of this book, or this is a point of interest about this book. So considering the context of the narrative that we are viewing in its genre, in its publication, when and where it was published, the time and place of the first publication can be very, very important. And also, if we are reviewing, because we don't always review modern books, we might be reviewing a classic book or talking about a classic book, and understanding that a book that was written in, say, the early 1900s in England will have a different sensibility to a book that was written in the early 2000s in America can be a very important point of consideration. When we think that will be a completely different cultural milieu, it will have a different language and a different base register for the styles of prose and the paradigm of storytelling in which it finds itself. So again, you can talk about it in comparison or in contrast to the modern genre, but it is important to be aware that it wasn't written in the modern genre, and therefore going, this is a bad book because it doesn't do X, which the modern genre does. You can say this book was written at an earlier time and place. And therefore, while it's not doing what we commonly expect in the modern genre, what it is doing is blah, 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 in relation to the paradigm of the time, that can be a really good way to get into what the text is actually doing. We can think about our target audience and demographic. If we're reviewing a YA novel, do we review it as if our target audience is a bunch of people who typically read YA? Or do we review it with a bunch of people who don't read YA? Because how you approach your review, what you actually talk about, the style of rhetoric you use will change whether or not you're addressing a crowd, and that's what reviews do. You're addressing a crowd to convince people who don't normally read YA to read this YA novel, or you're talking to a crowd who usually read YA and you go, this is exactly the thing that we should be reading because it's doing all the things that we like. And it's a different element to how we structure, how we frame, how we phrase our discussion. If we are discussing a classic text and we're doing it for a scholastic or academic more style audience, we will structure our review and our register, our style of rhetoric, the words that we use and the points that we bring up very, very differently than if we are talking to our friends in the bar or talking to our friends in a coffee shop, because there's a completely different relationship there. You're making assumptions about who you're doing the review for, and therefore, if we know what our assumptions about our target audience or target demographic are, that can help us hone in and improve the style of our review. The more aware we are of what it is that we are doing, maybe unthinkingly or unconsciously, or because this is the way that we've always done it, if we actually address those things and think about why we're doing it that way, who do we intend this for, that might help us improve and sharpen what we are doing and make our reviews more pointed. And again, politics and ideology, that can feed into a lot of different things, because sometimes it's not just about whether or not you liked a book. You might say that you might be looking at a book, reviewing a book in terms of how it addresses, attacks, undermines, argues for various political or ideological points of view, because not all fiction is just, it's about an entertaining story. Some of it is exploring like really in-depth, interesting concepts. So thinking about the politics and ideology, not only of the author, not only of the story and what is running through it, but also our own politics and ideologies, and then the politics and ideologies of our audience. All of those things. And again, it's dependent on the narrative. It's dependent on the actual article in front of us as to whether or not this is important. But we can think through those things. And again, that might give us another insight into what might be of interest in that book for another reader. You'll see here I put in characterization. Now, characters obviously appears in both option A and option B. What's the difference? Characters are the things in the text. You can describe them and go, there's this character and this character, and they have a cool spear and they do a flippy thing and they're always very funny. Characterization is about how those characters are realized. So instead of just thinking about describing the characters, sometimes, or even how we felt about the characters, looking at how characters are created, that process, so not the characters themselves, but how those characters are communicated to us, the characterization, how they are framed, how they are evoked on the page, that can actually be a very useful way into talking about that aspect of the text. And of course, you can apply that to prose, world building, plot, themes, setting, looking at how those things are evoked, not just identifying the thing and then saying whether or not we like it, but how are those things evoked in the text? How is the author playing with these things? Because sometimes in isolating that, discussing that, and raising those points, even if we personally don't enjoy that thing, someone watching or listening or reading our review will very much appreciate it because they don't necessarily have the same preferences that we have. And therefore, when you talk about what a book is actually doing rather than how we feel about it, then that gives them insight and it makes your review more applicable to a broader audience, not just those that agree with you and not just those that have basically polar opposite views. It removes the need for the person listening or reading the review, consuming the review, to know a great deal about your own personal preferences. And again, author biographical information. I know it's very popular to say, oh, the author is dead, but that has to do with author intentionality within the text being the dominant and main way to read a text and what the text meaning is. Author biographical information, like time and place of first publication or the place of the text within the genre, author biographical information can be very telling. If an author is female, if the author is a person of color, the gender, sex, sexuality, nationality, politics of the author, all of those things can be of interest in a review, even though it's not specifically about the book, it's about the author. But we've seen people going, I want to read more books by authors of color, or I want to read more books by women this year, or I want to read more books that are not Anglophone and therefore look outside of the traditional Western publishing framework. That is taking into account author biographical information. Discounting the author's involvement in the process is, well, it's a little bit insulting to the author that created the book that we're looking at. But sometimes it's actually really interesting seeing an author and the assumptions then that we sometimes make about authors, where we assume X, Y, or Z about them because I read that book and it came across that way. That author's completely different to how I thought. And it's a curious thing because one of the hardest things to do sometimes when you're reading is inclusion is not endorsement. And just because things are depicted in a novel does not necessarily mean that the author thinks that those things are good. The author may be including them for different reasons. And this is why when we do a lot of narrative analysis, we typically don't refer to the author. We create a construct, and quite often we refer to the narrator, which is a construct basically from the text built out, as opposed to author, which is a construct that the sort of the physical person has created as a persona. But that's getting into a whole sort of complicated thing, and I don't need to go into it here. So that's just to suggest a couple of different ways of doing it. It's not that any one way is wrong or any one way is right. We pick and choose the things that we are applying, and there will always be things that resonate more with us that we think are important because that's how we consume narrative. But we don't necessarily universalize that, because what you choose and think are important aspects of a novel, someone else might have a completely different criteria. Some people love action and battle sequences in novels, and other people go, yeah, that's probably my least favorite aspect of it. I'm really here for the long lingering looks and the conversations and that quiet moment between characters. And yeah, nothing's happening. They're just sitting there having a discussion, and they could be having a discussion about anything. But I love immersing myself in that. Or it could be, I'm here for the wonderful evocation of a setting or a style, or I'm here to enjoy the prose itself. And even if I don't particularly like the characters or the story, because it is so beautifully written, this is time well spent and I'm really enjoying it. We don't pick what other people choose to care about. So when we are writing a review or when we're constructing a review, it's sometimes important to bear in mind that what we think is important is not necessarily what someone else does. So to kind of summarize this about points that, questions and issues that I used to use to help me sharpen my focus when I was reviewing. The very first thing, even before I started jotting down points about the book, the first thing I always addressed was, who is my target audience? Who am I writing this for? Because I need to have an idea of what it is to try and put myself in their mindset of what I assume that they're going to want to hear about, things that they will need to know. That Knowing who my audience was always helped me as an initial foundational step. But then the second thing that I had to address was, well, what am I trying to do with my review? Am I trying to promote this book? Am I trying to evaluate the book and place it in the context of whether it is good or bad within a certain genre or a certain set of examples of texts? Am I trying to evaluate it against the canon of English literature, or am I evaluating it against a specific subset? Or am I trying to explain to people how I felt when I read it? Am I trying to give a sort of personal reading experience and tell them about that? Is that something that they want to know? Because once I've identified who my target audience is, you know, the age, the demographic, the culture, all of these sorts of things, training, background, then what I'm doing with the review, is it an academic review? Is it a popular review? Is this for marketing purposes and promotional purposes? Is this whatever reason? That those two things, depending on what you pick, can radically change your review. And it's not that you're changing your mind. It's not that you're being dishonest about any aspect of the novel. What you're doing is you're shuffling around the criteria to choose the most applicable, the things that you think are going to be best suited for that group. And then you're going to choose a register and you're going to choose a style, and all of those things come into play. Because if I'm writing a review of a new novel and I am writing it for a feminist literary journal that is very academic, then I'm not really going to be talking about how cool I thought the battle sequences are. That's not going to be applicable for that style of review. Well, very rarely is it going to be applicable for that style. It might be. It depends. Everything is so dependent on the actual narrative. But because I have a specific framework in mind, that might help me reorganize my thoughts, get a structure about how I want to talk about it, how I want to approach it. And because books are so individual, there's very rarely a one size fits all, because the next sort of 2 points that I almost always consider when I'm evaluating texts is their position in the genre. What is different about this book in relation to other books within the genre, or what is similar about this book to other books in the genre? Because both those things can be very telling about the type of book it is, whether or not readers will engage with it, whether or not it's going to be a good text to maybe use in a scholastic or academic setting. All of these different things come into play, because I know we all complain about, for instance, like with the Wheel of Time show, like so many people going, oh, is this the next Game of Thrones? Oh, this isn't the next Game of Thrones. You go, why do you keep comparing it to Game of Thrones? So, because a lot of people know about Game of Thrones. Therefore, when you talk about Wheel of Time, it's the natural comparator, in much the same way that, you know, it gets compared to Tolkien, because that again is a common point of understanding that you can illustrate and say, listen, in comparison to the Lord of the Rings, Wheel of Time does X differently. In comparison to Lord of the Rings, Wheel of Time does something very similar, because someone who is familiar with Lord of the Rings now can follow what you're saying better when you're talking about the Wheel of Time. It's very, very useful. And so comparing things to within the genre, I could choose a whole lot of obscure fantasy texts and go, oh, this reminds me of blah, blah by so-and-so. And it's an obscure indie publication that 7 people have read, me being one of them. While that is very cool to refer to a piece of esoteric knowledge, and it's great to bring awareness about indie authors, it's not useful for a review for a general readership, because no one will know why I'm making that comparison, because they haven't read the work that I am comparing the current work to. So if they haven't read the work that I'm talking about, I'm comparing it to a book that they haven't read, then how do they know what the point is? So you can see sometimes choosing a good, prominent, well-known example can be so incredibly useful. But it's not just about what it is doing the same, Sometimes it's about what it's doing differently. And that can be very, very useful. And then we can think about almost a text specific thing. And this falls back on not just what we personally prefer, but when we're reading, you go, you know what? There is this one thing or these three things that are really noteworthy about the book, something that sticks out. Now, it could be they are very positive things, could be that they are very negative things. You could go, this is the world's most amazing book in the world. But dear God, are the female characters absolutely atrociously realized on the page? They are so stereotypical. Their only purpose is to act as plot functions for the male heroes, or the exact reverse. It depends. But when you read a book, you might go, it's not that all the characters are bad, but there's might be a specific subset of characters or a specific aspect of the plot. You go, this author has used the same sort of plot device of, oh, this is a problematic character, I'll have them kidnapped and taken away into slavery multiple times in the text. And you go, why do you keep going back to that well? Has it not run dry yet? So something that sticks out about the book, and that is going to depend on your experience, your knowledge of the field, your knowledge of other texts. That's where you really rely on your own personal expertise to be able to isolate these elements that really stand out as worth discussing, even if they're not necessarily in your standard criteria that you apply for your review. And then very lastly, the thing that helps me so much when I'm doing this is it's not just isolating what the elements are. Oh, the world building is good. Tells me nothing. Why is the world building good? How does the author evoke the world building? Maybe take out a couple of examples, a couple of excerpts. Think of some of the concepts that are worked in. Oh, this author, the tone was amazing. It created this amazing atmosphere. Again, not really revealing. What is the atmosphere is the first question. Then how and why are your follow-up questions. So isolate elements, because that's what we use a lot of our criteria for, is to help us hone in and isolate elements. And then we start applying how, why. And once we've done that, we go, is this successful? Is this something that the author has communicated successfully? Does it lead us to understand what the author intention is? Because we think that the author was trying to scare us and the author ended up making us laugh. Then you go, the author clearly wanted this to be scary, but it actually ends up really funny because of, and you can talk about that aspect. So again, while all of these things are going to be incredibly text specific, depending on the book that you're looking at, you can see these general approaches, these general questions help us focus. Who are we doing the review for? What are we trying to do with the review? How does the text fit in with the rest of the genre in comparison or in contrast? Is there something particularly noteworthy about the book? What is something that this book does that really sticks out to you that you go, you know what, if I remember one thing about this book, it'll be this thing. And then when we're discussing all of those sort of criteria that we've set up, the different categories we've set up, it's not just about saying it has this thing and I've evaluated it 4 out of 5 stars. It's how does it do it? Why is it being done that way? What does that add? How do all of these things interrelate? So hopefully this has given you some insight into the weirdness of my brain, but also maybe there's something here that is going to help you think about how you want to do your reviews, how you want to approach what it is that you do, because reviewing is always going to be about your approach. No one can say that you are doing it wrong, because it is almost always going to be the right way for you to do it. But we can develop and refine our techniques. We can make our techniques more flexible. And that, I think, is a very useful thing, particularly when we're reviewing lots of different books. So I hope that at least some of what I've discussed here, even if it doesn't change how you're going to do a review or doesn't really impact you in any way, but it gives you an idea of different things to think about. I am not trying to tell you how to do your review. I'm just trying to raise different ways that we can think about it, different ways that we can refine it, because the better we understand how we approach books, the better we understand our own personal preferences, our own personal biases, and the better we understand what it is that we are doing when we review. Once we have all of those things, we can improve or change or alter our techniques in a way that is mindful rather than it kind of worked the last time, so I'm just going to keep doing this, but I don't know why it worked. So the more we know, the more we can refine and define our own individual takes. So thank you so much for watching. I hope it's been useful. Thank you for your continued support, and I'll see you in the next one.